Well, if you sat down with one of the new atheists, people like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, the late Christopher Hitchens, and asked them why they don't think God is real, or they don't think that Christianity is true, what do you think they'd say? They'd probably give you several reasons. Their arguments for the existence of God, that the arguments for the existence of God just aren't that persuasive to them, although I think, frankly, they just don't understand them properly. That evolution disproves God, but there are many Christians who believe in evolution, so even if you don't agree, that argument I think also sort of falls flat. But I think the biggest reason that they give, well, certainly in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, I think he gives the most space to the Conquest. Or more generally, the problem of evil. How can you believe in a loving God when there's so much pain and suffering in the world? And how can you believe in a loving God who commands people to commit genocide, to go in and wipe out the Canaanites? That essentially is what we're going to be thinking about today, the conquest, from when they scope out the land in the book of Numbers through to the time of Joshua and into the time of the Judges, when they begin to take possession of the land. It's tied to the promises made to Abraham, that this is the land that God promised to give his descendants, which we saw a few weeks ago. It's actually linked with the creation account itself. So they're told that they're going to go into, or that God's going to give them the good land, like we see emphasized in Genesis 1, where they will enjoy God's blessing, which we also saw was a major theme in Genesis 1. They will be fruitful and multiply, and they will subdue the land. The Hebrew word there is kavash. In Numbers 32, Moses said to two of the tribes of Israel, "If you will do this, if you will arm yourselves before Yahweh for battle, and if all of you who are armed cross over the Jordan before Yahweh until he has driven his enemies out before him, when the land is subdued, kavash, before Yahweh, you may return and be free from your obligations to Yahweh and to Israel, and this land will be your possession." You see that same idea, kavash, subduing the land, there in the conquest. And again, in Joshua 18, the whole assembly of the Israelites gathered at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The country was brought under the control, it was kavashed, it was subdued, but there were still 7 Israelite tribes who had not yet received their inheritance. The question, coming back to the new atheist, is what makes this a good thing? What makes it okay for God to tell them to do this? Now, to be honest, that is a sermon topic all on its own. There's a lot that we could unpack there, and we're not going to do that today. I'm not, by putting it to one side though, I'm not keen to downplay just how difficult a question this is. I think it is one that we need to wrestle with. It is one that I think we need to do business with. But a partial answer, I think, is found in Genesis 15. God says to Abraham, "You will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here." Why? "For the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." And we get an idea of what that looked like in Leviticus 18, where God says to the Israelites, he tells them about all the sorts of sins that they mustn't involve themselves with. Things like child sacrifice. Because on account of sins like these, God is driving out the Canaanites. To be sure, this doesn't completely answer the question, but it does highlight an important issue. God will not put up with sin forever. Anybody's sin. God is patient, but there will come a time when sin will be dealt with. And for the Canaanites, by the time we reach the book of Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges, God's patience has run out. They've done enough damage, and they are going to be held accountable. And the Israelites going in to take the land is God's way of bringing judgment upon them. So we're going to take a look at this conquest in 3 stages. In Numbers, where they scope out the land. In Joshua, where they begin to take the land, when they start taking the land. And in Judges, where actually we see that they failed to take the land. And we'll think a little bit about what that means for us today. So, scoping out the land. In the book of Numbers, the Israelites set off from Mount Sinai. Now coming to the beginning of Numbers, before the passage that we read earlier. They set off from Mount Sinai to take the land that God had promised to give them. But before they've reached the border, before they've even got to the promised land, things are already going really badly. We saw hints of this back in Exodus before they got to Mount Sinai. But it just gets worse. Through the book of Numbers, the Israelites just turn out to be a horrendous bunch to deal with. The book of Numbers is full of stories of the Israelites grumbling against God, grumbling against Moses, planning mutinies, begging to go back to Egypt because they can't bring themselves to trust God that what He has planned for them on the other side is better. They'd rather have the cucumbers back in Egypt. But things really hit an all-time low when we get to chapter 13, the passage that we read. I'm also just going to swap out this music stand quickly. That feels a little bit more secure. Things really get bad when we get to chapter 13. Moses sends out 12 people, a representative from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, to bring back a sample of the land, to scope it out, to see what it's like, to see what it is that they're dealing with. And that's what they do. And when they report back after 40 days, they tell the Israelites, they tell the rest of the community that this place is incredible. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here's its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and their cities are fortified and very large. 2 guys, Joshua and Caleb, stand up and they stand up to them and say, no, come on, guys, we can take them. We can do this. We've got God on our side. We'll be okay. But they get shouted down, and the Israelites decide not to go, again, wishing that they were back in Egypt. What is clear in their response is that the Israelites don't trust that God can give them what He's promised to. So in chapter 14, God confronts them and actually threatens to wipe them out. But Moses intercedes for them, and he appeals to God's character. So, Numbers 14, verse 18. Yahweh is slow to anger, abounding in love, and forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet He does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sin of their parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. Which, although we didn't actually have time to look at it a few weeks ago, this is how God actually introduces Himself to, but this is how God presents Himself to Moses when he hides in the cleft of the rock and actually passes by. This is what He's saying. Yahweh, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in love. What we see there as well is that God's compassion, or God revealing Himself as compassionate, is also linked with Israel's sin. So while Moses is on top of Mount Sinai, receiving the law, God revealing Himself to him, the Israelites are down at the bottom making a golden calf. But God reveals Himself as compassionate. He will deal with sin, but He is slow to anger, patient, and kind. The bottom line is that God says to the Israelites here in Numbers that if you don't want to go to the promised land, fine. You won't then. I'll give it to your children. You can wander the desert for 40 years. But he does make an exception for Caleb and Joshua because they were faithful to him. They will lead the next generation into the promised land. The book of Deuteronomy then, which we looked at a little bit last week, but is there between Numbers and Joshua, is a set of sermons that Moses gives on the plains of Moab. Now they're on the border of the promised land. They're about to go in, and Moses is pleading with them, guys, please don't stuff this up again. We saw what happened last time. We saw how hard-hearted your parents were. Let's do it right this time. Let's remain faithful to Yahweh. Let's give him our allegiance. And let's trust him to do what he said he was going to do. And then he dies, and Joshua takes over as Israel's leader, as the one who's going to take them into the promised land, which actually brings us to the book of Joshua, which opens with a chapter that we looked at earlier in the year. So here they are on the brink of the land, starting to take the land, and the passage that we looked at a few months ago, what on earth did I write here? Anyway, they're on the brink of the promised land, and they're about to go, and they're about to do the thing, and Joshua says to them, guys, be strong and stand firm. And God says to Joshua, be strong and stand firm. Don't be afraid. We've got this. I will be with you. I will be there with you. As we sang earlier, the battle belongs to God. The battle belongs to him. And so that's what they do. Not perfectly, but they go in and they take the land. In chapter 6 and 7, the Israelites have conquered Jericho and they turn their sights on Ai, but they weren't able to conquer Ai because of the sin of Achan, who took some of the loot from the city of Jericho, which he wasn't supposed to. And in chapter 9, they actually make a covenant with the Gibeonites, which, again, they weren't supposed to. So they don't do it perfectly. But on the whole, things go pretty well. They drive out many of the nations who are living in the land, and the book begins and ends, and I think the point is to emphasize this, the book begins and ends with God's faithfulness. At the end of the book, when all is said and done, they've still got work to do, but Joshua has taken them as far as he can, and is now giving his farewell speech. We read in Joshua 23:14, you know with all your heart that not one of the good promises Yahweh your God gave to you has failed. Not one of them. Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one has failed. God has done everything that he said he would do. God has shown himself to be absolutely faithful. That's something that we can rely on in the character of God, that he is absolutely faithful to what he promises. By the time the book of Joshua ends, though, like I said, the work isn't finished. Joshua dies, and he urges the Israelites, before he does so, to remain faithful to God, like Moses did back in Deuteronomy. To stay loyal to Yahweh, to love him with all their heart, with all their soul, with all their strength. And the people promise that that's exactly what they're going to do. And Joshua ends on a massive high. Then comes the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, we see the Israelites failing to take the land. After Joshua died, the tribes of Israel went to battle to continue the work of taking the land. And it starts okay. But as the first chapter moves on, we see things sort of get progressively worse. That they started by being able to conquer this or that area, but then they weren't able to drive those people out. And then they weren't quite able to defeat those people. And then they basically didn't even try with those other people. By the time it ends, it's going really badly, and by the end of the first chapter, they're actually just coexisting with the Canaanites, rather than conquering the land that God said that they were supposed to take. And what that leads to is that they slip into the worship of other gods. They start serving the Baals and the Ashtaroths. And we see a cycle emerge that runs through the book of Judges. Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord, so God hands them over to whatever the enemy was. They panic, they cry out to the Lord, they ask for his deliverance, so he raises up a deliverer, he raises up a judge, and that judge rescues them from whoever that enemy was. And for a time, they enjoy rest. While ever that judge is running things, while ever that judge is in charge, things go okay. Until that judge dies, and then they slip back into sin, and a cycle begins again. I call it a cycle. It's actually more like a downward spiral. In chapter 6, God raises up Gideon, but only after having a go at the Israelites for, guys, you're not listening again. They're still going after other gods, and by the time we reach Samson, that says salmon. By the time we reach Samson, who was already a loose cannon, if you just read Samson's story, it's wild. But by the time we actually get there, we see that the Israelites would actually just prefer to coexist with the Canaanites. So Judges 15, when Samson is busy getting revenge on the Philistines, the Israelites actually come to Samson and confront him. Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? Why have you done this? Why are you ruffling feathers? Why are you disturbing the peace? Let's just coexist with them. Let's just accept that they're in charge and get on with our lives. But the story doesn't end there. It actually gets worse. In chapters 17 to 21, things spiral down even more, completely out of control. In chapters 17 and 18, we meet a man called Micah who gets hired as a guy's personal priest. Never mind that the story opens with him returning some silver that he stole from his mom. And then his mom's like, "Oh, you returned the silver, cool, let's make it into a god." You know, as one does. But then he gets nicked by some other guys who are like, no, we want you to be our priest. And so they cart him off. And then when they get confronted, they're more powerful than the guys who initially hired Micah as the priest. So they're just like, well, I mean, we're stronger than you, so go away. We've got this guy now. So it's completely... You kind of get to the end of the story scratching your head like, why? What? How? It asks far more questions than it answers. In chapters 19 to 21, things get even worse. We've got an incident where there's a Levite and his concubine. And they're going to a city, and it basically, the way the story unfolds, I'll actually just leave you to read that for yourself. But it's a story that strongly resembles the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It ends with the concubine actually, her dead body being cut up and distributed to different parts of the nation of Israel, which sparks a civil war, and one of the tribes almost gets wiped out. They're kind of this close, and they realize, oh flip, we've only got men left, and so they just go and steal a bunch of women from a neighboring town. It's all quite horrendous. What this raises, though, is what does this mean for the way that the book of Joshua ended? The way that Joshua ends is that God was completely faithful to all his promises, that not one failed to come about, that not one of God's promises was left undone. But when we get to Judges, and particularly by the end of Judges, where things are just a mess, it kind of looks like God's promises haven't come true, that they haven't managed to take the land. The answer, I think, is that as the job went on of driving the nations out, as the job went on of taking the land, God, on his part, was completely faithful. God did everything he said he would do. If the people trusted him and did as he asked, the book of Judges could have gone very differently. But they didn't. Things didn't go well because the people weren't faithful to their end of the deal. They weren't faithful to Yahweh. And I think this says something for how God works with us too. God is absolutely faithful. God can be completely trusted in every area of our lives. And our salvation is completely owed to him. But for our relationship with him to thrive, we can't just do what we want. We can't just live however we want and expect that relationship to work. We've also got a part to play. And if we want him to work in us and through us, he's not going to do that without us. We've got a part to play too. To be sure, it's the Spirit who does the work. But we do need to cooperate. If we're going to resist the work of the Spirit, things are not going to go well for us. As he grows us in godliness, as God grows us in godliness, he doesn't work in us without us. We can't sit back and expect God to do everything, or just to go along with what the world does, with the world that opposes him, the world that gives him the finger, and then turn around and say, hey, but you're meant to be faithful. Like, why am I not seeing progress? God is faithful. God is faithful to his promises and always will be, but he expects a degree of faithfulness from us too. I think that's also what we see in, say, Galatians, that we're expected to keep in step with the Spirit. That the gift of the sort of fruit that's meant to be cultivated in our lives, the sort of things that we should expect to see as gardening metaphors. And I'm not much of a gardener. I'm a bit of a bimbo when it comes to these sorts of things. That and DIY. But you can't just toss a bunch of seeds and be like, cool, go. You need to cultivate it. You need to put in the work as well. God is the one who gives the growth, and ultimately we attribute it to him. But God doesn't work in us without us. A number of points along the way, at a number of points along the way in this last section of Judges, where things are spiraling completely out of control, there's a line that gets repeated a few times in a few variations, but more or less the same thing. In those days, Israel had no king. Maybe that's why things were spiraling out of control. Maybe they didn't have strong leadership. I don't think that was the case. But in any case, I think it's pointing us in the direction of what's going to unfold in the books of Samuel and the books of Kings. But that'll have to wait till next week.